All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this next edition in our Wild Conversation series. Just a few housekeeping measures before we get started. This is a webinar, and all attendees are on mute. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A or chat box, and we will make sure those questions get to our moderator. If we do need to restart this webinar for any reason, please check your email for a new link. And we are recording this session, and it will be on our YouTube channel after we finish. The Wanton Injustice Legal Detail, WILD, was started this summer to harness the collective power of Twin Cities Diversity and Practices membership and remedy systemic anti-Black racism in the Twin Cities by partnering with and amplifying the work of existing community organizations. And today, our moderator is Lucas Castor. Lucas Castor is a civil rights and plaintiffs employment lawyer at Nichols Castor. He's a member of the Minnesota Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and he is our Emerging Leaders Group recruiting lead. And with that, I will turn it over to Lucas Castor and Nekima Levy Armstrong, our guests.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Liz, for that kind introduction. It's my honor and privilege to welcome Nekima Levy Armstrong this morning. Mrs. Levy Armstrong is a civil rights attorney. She's an activist. If you have been paying attention in any respect, you know that she's been out advocating and being an activist throughout this summer and for several years before that. She's also the executive director of Wayfinder Foundation. She's a former professor at the University of St. Thomas, former president of the NAACP, former chair of the advisory commission that I am now on for the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights. We saw her run for mayor recently, and also the owner of Black Pearl Consulting. As if that wasn't enough, she's also a mother and a husband, or a mother and a wife, I'm sorry. So welcome, Ms. Nekima. We appreciate you showing up today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Good. I wanted to start, we have an hour, a period of time here today, but I wanted to start a little bit and talk about how you got here, about your background, and because you're not originally from Minnesota, and so why you ended up here and why you're so involved now. So can you explain a little bit to us about your background?
Sure. So I was born in Jackson, Mississippi, but moved to South Central LA when I was about 8.5 years old. I saw a lot of intersecting issues that impacted my community, which was largely a low-income Black and Brown community. I went off to boarding school in New England when I was 14, went to USC, undergrad, and the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana for law school. And shortly after law school, I went to work for the Lawyers Committee for civil rights in Washington, D.C., and then got hired at my alma mater, University of Illinois, as a visiting law professor. And then from there, got hired at the University of St. Thomas Law School. And initially, when I was hired at St. Thomas was maybe 2 years old at the time, so it was brand new. We hadn't even moved into the new building yet. But I was really intrigued about being connected to a law school focused on faith and social justice. And when I got hired at St. Thomas, my focus actually was on family law, working with folks who were experiencing domestic violence and high conflict custody cases. And after a couple of years of being in the Twin Cities, I started to pay closer attention to the racial disparities that were in existence here. So initially, when I was brought to the Twin Cities, I was told how progressive, the Twin Cities were, that it's a great place to raise my family. And that was my mindset, living in a suburb for the first, couple years. And then when I started looking at the local African-American papers and seeing issues regarding policing, disparities in public education, income, housing, I decided to shift from family law to civil rights and launch the community justice existence today. And it's an award-winning civil rights legal clinic.
And did you, always have it in your mind growing up that, you know, being a civil rights lawyer or being involved in these issues was something that you wanted to do?
Well, I made the decision when I was 9 years old that I wanted to become a lawyer. And it was largely because of the issues that were happening in my community in Los Angeles. In the mid 1980s was the start of the war on drugs. And so we had an overconcentration of police in our community, a great deal of poverty, and the criminal justice system became a revolving door in my community. And around that same time, I had seen lawyers on television advocating for people. And I said, if I can become a lawyer, maybe I can help change things in my community.
And do you see, as someone who's now come to Minnesota, do you see Minnesota as your home now for the foreseeable future?
Well, I would say, I've somehow been able to brave the cold. Minnesota feels like home to me after being here since 2003. It does become difficult, though, to be honest, because it seems like there's one thing after another in terms of the issues that we're having to battle. And it definitely can wear down your spirit when you are constantly having to take on the system and sometimes feeling that, there's not enough people, who are engaged in the fight. So in order to stay balanced, I try to travel, as often as I can just to, stay sane, in the midst of everything that's going on. But I'm really guided by my faith, right? This is where I feel that God has placed me. And so this is where I've been since 2003. And I really love Minnesota. I love the people here. And I love being able to fight for justice here.
And do you feel as though, as someone who's come to Minnesota, I mean, one of the things, I was born and raised in South Minneapolis, but was gone for about 15 years. And one of the things that I've often heard from people that come to the Twin Cities is that it's hard to break in, that people have their group of friends that they stick with. And have you found it hard in that circumstance coming into Minnesota as someone who's obviously on the forefront of advocating for justice, advocating for civil rights? Do you find it hard for people, or have you experienced that people are resistant to you being out in the front as someone who isn't originally from Minnesota?
Yeah, I think that there is some level of resistance. I think part of it, has to do with the fact that I made a conscious decision to not just try to blend in. Once I realized what was happening, once I developed some level of understanding of the culture here, I had to make a conscious decision. Either I'm going to go along to get along, or I'm going to go against the grain to challenge issues, knowing that some people won't like it, knowing that there's going to be resistance, but also knowing that it's the right thing to do. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I have a lot of people who find my activism to be refreshing because I'm unapologetic in terms of just speaking the truth and letting the chips fall where they may. And other people who are uncomfortable with the things that I say, with, shutting down freeways and intersections at times. And just for me personally, I think the most important thing is doing what I feel called to do. And that's to challenge the status quo and to try to make life better for those who are on the margins of society and who typically don't have a voice.
And do you think, there's this concept of Minnesota nice, sort of non-confrontational sort of way of being. Do you think that in some way has impacted your work? Do you think it impacts the people from Minnesota being able to respond to these issues in an abrupt, sort of straightforward way?
Yeah, there's definitely a very strong Minnesota nice culture where unfortunately people might smile, but not really reveal what's on their minds or in their hearts about various issues that are going on. And again, I had to decipher, aspects of the culture in order to understand, what was really going on here and how we got to the place where we have some of the highest racial disparities in the country, while there's also a false reputation of Minnesota being the most progressive place in the country. And so I think a lot of that stems from Minnesota nice, but having lived in different places around the country, I've had to go in and figure out my cultural environment and some of the nuances in order to, be effective at doing the work that I do.
Yeah, and I want to sort of, you've been talking about the sort of inequities that exist here in the Twin Cities in particular. And I want to transition now to talk about some of these issues in particular, specifically around the idea of police reform. There's been a lot of talk about this, since the events of this summer, but also for the last couple of years in terms of what we've seen around the country. And what is, as someone who's on the forefront of these issues, what do you see as this idea of reimagining police or community safety?
Well, I would say that, first and foremost, issues of police abuse have been going on for decades in the Twin Cities and in the state of Minnesota. I would say that people started to pay more close attention to the issue in 2014 after Mike Brown, 17-year-old African-American young man, was killed by Officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, we had some minor protests in 2013 here when a young man named Terrence Franklin was killed in the home of a South Minneapolis basement by police. He was unarmed, shot multiple times. There was no accountability. But I would say once the events and the uprisings happened in Ferguson, then people around the nation started to pay attention, as well as here. And I actually traveled to Ferguson as a volunteer through the National Lawyers Guild, had my own experiences as far as being tear gassed and just feeling like I was in the midst of a war zone in that environment. And so when I came back from Ferguson after 1 week in November of 2014, I was approached by young people saying that they were going to launch BLM Minneapolis. Would I help them? At the time, I had no idea, what help I could provide, but I showed up anyway. And literally our first action was to shut down I-35 in solidarity with folks in Ferguson, with folks in New York where Eric Garner was killed, folks in Ohio where Tamir Rice was killed, 12-year-old boy. And from that point, we started to bring attention to the systemic racism that is inherent within the system of policing. Because of Minnesota's nice culture, I think that a lot of these issues have been allowed to be swept under the rug for many, many years. And people are able to really enjoy their lives, go to their cabins, have fun with their families, and ignore the serious racial injustices that undergird our system of policing. So I think that, it's important to kind of lay that groundwork before talking about reimagining policing. First, people need to get a grasp of what the actual problems are. And a big part of the problem has to do with the lack of discipline of police officers in Minneapolis and around the Twin Cities. And this is when they violate people's rights. Maybe they're being disrespectful, maybe they're roughing people up. Maybe they are overcriminalizing people and giving them tickets or bringing them into the justice system for very minor offenses. And then, I would say most obvious aspect of this has to do with the police killings. But that is after a long line of other inequities and injustices have happened that we can get to the place where police officers are able to kill people with impunity. So anyone who is interested in working in these areas, we need to understand that there's policies, there's laws, there's practices and procedures that undergird what is happening within this system. And most of the time, these things go unchallenged. As lawyers, when we are hired to take on these cases, the focus is on your individual client typically. So there's not really a body that's here that's focused on civil rights for all from a racial perspective with regard to policing. And so we've had some attorneys who've been able to come in, represent Black people who've been harmed or families, whose loved one was killed by police. And sometimes they're able to get a payout, but that doesn't necessarily lead to systemic change in terms of critically examining these policies and these laws and these practices. So in terms of reimagining it again, looking at the disciplinary policies, ensuring that there is transparency and accountability within the system. So that means not just blindly treating law enforcement agencies to cover a case to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, knowing that they have an abysmal track record when it comes to competently investigating police killings, and then also holding police officers accountable. They've had some very shady dealings in these areas, and yet most people, when they hear, oh, there's an independent investigation, people just turn a blind eye to what's actually happening in that investigation. And then when the outcome, which 99% of the time is that a police killing was justified, people just kind of move on with their lives. And that, to me, is part of the problem. We have to wake up, we have to be vigilant, and we have to demand accountability and transparency, and equity in terms of how the procedures and the rules are applied in these situations.
I appreciate that rundown of where you see things going, and I wanted to touch on a couple of the points that you brought up. One of which was that I wrote down. Was this idea of, you referenced it a couple of times, shutting down the freeway, and to a lot of people, a lot of people's response, even if they may be sympathetic to these ideas in terms of police reform, their response to that may be, well, don't do it in such a way that is inconvenient. And I'm interested in your perspective in terms of why those means of protest or raising the issues was decided to go forward, and why you think that that's so important.
Well, I would say that, one, I'm not as concerned about people who are breathing and people who don't have any problem with police being inconvenienced by protests and demonstrations. I think that if people realize the magnitude of the problems and the fact that we're talking about lives being lost and no accountability, at some point, the humanity in us has to come to the forefront. And questions need to be asked as far as, why would people put their lives on the line to shut down a freeway unless there was something serious behind it? I never imagined that I would be involved in demonstrations that, shut down freeways or shut down the Mall of America. But after I went to Ferguson, and also just, I majored in African American Studies at the University of Southern California. So I understand our history to some degree in terms of how what's happening now with police shootings is a perpetuation of the racial injustices that have always happened in policing in this country, and having people understand that law enforcement started out as slave catchers, right? And so that history is still with us in terms of some of the tactics and the mechanisms that are used to go into poor Black communities and to essentially act as an occupying force. If you look at the city of Minneapolis, for example, over 92% of officers don't even live in the city of Minneapolis. So they have no nexus to the community, no vested interest in our well-being as a community, but they're allowed to come in from the suburbs and exurbs, primarily all white communities, and exert authority and control over people who live here, often people who are experiencing socioeconomic issues and barriers to upward mobility, which plays a role in terms of some of the things that happen in our communities. And so I'm not concerned about inconvenience. Dr. King even talked about it. He talked about how, in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, he said, listen, I'm not as worried about Ku Klux Klanners or the white citizens counselors. I'm looking at the white moderates. You all are worried about inconvenience. You're worried about, the time that we're spending in protests, and you're telling us that through the passage of time, it's going to cure these racial inequalities that we're dealing with. Well, you're part of the problem if that's what you think. And you're willing to comment from the sidelines, but not get involved in using your power and privilege to affect change. And I think that a lot of that is going on here, where people think that there's other methods that make them feel comfortable that are going to lead to change. And I haven't seen it happen yet. And I'm saying this as a law professor who ran a civil rights legal clinic for many years, where we wrote position papers, authored scholarly articles that appeared in major journals around the country, went to the legislature, went to the boardrooms, went to backroom meetings, we talked to the media. We did everything that we could to try to raise awareness about these issues. And often because we were nice rules, people in positions of power, as well as mainstream white Minnesotans, cast a blind eye to these issues. And so I've been able to see the shift in terms of going from that particular approach to actually going out in the streets, and the leverage that we're able to have because they know that we are committed to this cause and awareness and pushing for changes. For me personally, I have here now, after, being arrested, a couple of times, after being charged with 8 misdemeanors, after we shut down the Mall of America, it has taken the fear out of me. And I further empathize and understand what Rosa Parks went through when she refused to give up her seat to a white man and she was arrested, what Dr. King went through, having been arrested dozens of times for standing up for freedom, justice, and equality. And so those who care more about comfort and convenience are part of the problem, especially if you're not using your power and privilege to challenge the status quo.
And I think that transitions very well to one of the thoughts that came into my mind as you were talking. And I think is sort of the concept that you're circling around that I have thought about for a while, in the sense of, in response to everything that happened this summer and previously, there has been certainly a focus within the Twin Cities community about this idea of police reform. And my response in some respects has been, yes, I think we need police reform. We need to have a serious conversation about that. But we also need to look at ourselves as general community members, because once we start saying, well, it's only the police is the problem, we relieve ourselves of any sort of personal responsibility and personal involvement. And I just wonder what your thought process is on that. I think that's what you're sort of talking about, that each person needs to take, get involved, take their personal responsibility, but just interested in your thoughts.
Absolutely. So if you look at the shooting of Terrence Franklin, which I mentioned earlier, 2013, Jamar Clark, 2015, November 15th of 2015, young African-American man who was standing at the back of an ambulance. 2 officers approached him and basically, put him in a chokehold, slammed him to the ground, and in 61 seconds, he was dead. And in front of dozens of Black witnesses in North Minneapolis. That led to an 18-day occupation outside of the 4th Precinct Police Station. And for many Minnesotans, this was the first time that they had started to pay attention to the issues here. We had so many people from across the Twin Cities and even outstate Minnesota who brought food and supplies and gloves and hot cocoa and blankets and firewood because they knew that something happened that was almost unspeakable in terms of a life being needlessly taken by police that they trusted to protect and serve. And then for a couple years, after Jamar Clark was killed, we had Philando Castile, who was killed in July of 2016. And of course, just horrible circumstances, followed the rules, followed the law, was still killed, no accountability for officers. That still made people feel that this is just an anomaly. This is just one officer's mistake, one bad apple that needs to be rooted out potentially. And then when Justine Damon Rusacek was killed in South Minneapolis in July of 2017, that's when some people began to wake up and to understand this is not just something that happens in North Minneapolis. This is not just something that happens to Black people. This can happen to anyone if we do not rein in our police department and to hold them accountable. So it is everyone's problem. We are the ones who vote for our elected officials. That is the reason I ran for mayor in 2017 on a police accountability platform, because the mayor has a significant amount of authority over the police department. So we vote these people in. We vote in the city council, who for many years have been silent in the face of police shootings and police abuse, quietly settling cases in the tens of millions of dollars. We elect our governor, we elect our legislature. They knock on our doors, they ask for money. So, and we use our tax dollars to fund police officers and their salaries and benefits and pensions. So it is all of our responsibility, but too often we put the burden on those who are most vulnerable within the system and most prone to police abuse to solve these issues. And then when people in those positions actually rise up and speak up, we demonize them. We make the protesters the problem instead of the system that is unfortunately creating police who are allowed to kill with impunity. And then even beyond that, allowed to over criminalize people who already have challenges from a socioeconomic perspective. Like, how can we say we're humane in a society that allows these things to happen? And one way that we can say that is because of history, right? How many white people, well-intended, church-going white folks, drank out of whites-only water fountains during the Jim Crow era, used whites-only bathrooms, ate at whites-only restaurants, and sent their kids to whites-only schools? They bought into the system and they cast a blind eye to the racial injustices, just as too many are doing today.
And I think, there was another thought as you were just talking about that, in terms of the perspective of, in particular, I think a majority or a large percentage of white people. And, one of the things I was just having a conversation with my family about these issues a couple nights ago, and one of the things I said, and I think this is one of the points you were just hitting on, was, there have been people generally who have been talking about these issues for as long as we can remember. Why does it take this extreme for the majorities to start to listen? It shouldn't be that way. My sort of impression was that's something you're saying. Why do we have to get to this point before change actually starts happening? Right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Why do you have to watch a video of a white officer with his knee on a black man's neck for 8.5, 9 minutes to be outraged about what's happening within the system? And why did it take George Floyd being killed before actually talking about these issues and caring about these issues and claiming to want to change what's happening? There have been many people killed before George Floyd, some of whom killed on video, some of whom not. And most people just sit silently by and allow it to happen. And to me, that's unconscionable.
And so what do you see, one of the other things you touched on was, you talked about how the mayor is part of the structure of governance for the police, specifically in Minneapolis. There's been some discussions this summer about redoing that. The city council has been investigating new measures to, split the department into a public safety department. And it's something we've been talking about during the process of these wild conversations, and, have gotten different perspectives on it. I just wonder what, someone who ran for mayor, what your perspective is on how we can affect that change and what we should be looking for people in those positions.
Well, I would say, unfortunately, city council is inept and incompetent as far as addressing policing issues. None of them have a background in studying these issues, even looking at sound policy recommendations for these issues. And I'm saying this as someone who has gone to City Hall on multiple occasions, testified before city council members and the mayor, as well as met privately with many city council members to get them to take action, as opposed to just continuing to rubber stamp settlements behind closed doors. And they have been completely silent the entire time, up until the world was watching Minnesota after George Floyd was killed. And what I saw in that whole debacle that happened in Powderhorn Park was really a power grab at the end of the day, going from the vested power over the police, essentially in one person, which is the mayor, who we can hold accountable, and dividing it between 13 city council members as well as the mayor. And my thought is, first of all, you all don't agree. And so what is that going to do, when you're trying to make a major policy decision and there's no agreement amongst the 14 of you on which direction to go? That's going to leave the people out in the cold. And then who do we actually hold accountable when the job is not done? That's what I saw. I saw a power grab. I saw people trying to snatch headlines, going on CNN without any real substance behind what was being proposed, with no research, no focus groups, no real engagement with the community, but putting forward very radical ideas when you've had ample opportunity before George Floyd was killed to actually use your power that you do have. So I was not in support of what City Council was proposing as far as dismantling the police and putting in a new Office of Community Safety for all the reasons that I just mentioned. And I said, you know, we need to take a step back and actually engage the people who are most impacted. First of all, you go to Powderhorn Park, very few Black people there, and we're the ones who suffer the highest instances of community violence as well as police violence. So why would you bypass that community and go talk to white folks who have largely been silent in the face of these injustices? White people who are liberal, who are progressive, who think they're doing the right thing, but who are, again, reinforcing this notion of Black inferiority when we're being treated as if we're not intelligent enough to engage in these conversations about what we need as a community. So that was the approach that I took, you know, in that situation. I think that the Charter Commission did the right thing in terms of pushing pause on the process and saying, go back and do your homework and get information so that we don't make the situation worse, which is what I think would have happened if City Council had had their way. And you can see from the political pressure, we've had several City Council members announce that they're not running for re-election. And these were some of the main people who were championing, you know, this new proposal. I would say, you know, the first thing they should have done was to get rid of Bob Crow, who, you know, has been the head of the Police Federation for many years, has fomented a lot of the hatred that, you know, exists out there, and demonizing of victims of police shootings, and, you know, has been violent himself, you know, as a police officer. So he had no business being in a leadership position in the way that he was. And so we were saying to mayor and city council members, at a minimum, get rid of Bob Crow, right? I'm glad he's announced his retirement at the end of this month, but it was long overdue. Beyond that, all they need to do is look at the records of officers who've engaged in excessive force, and they need to find a way to get them, you know, off of the police force. They need to also hire within the community and actually put forward pipeline programs to be able to hire people who actually do live in Minneapolis, which would yield a more diverse police force than what we currently have right now. And then we need to redirect some of the resources that are now being used to fund policing. So for example, police officers shouldn't be going out to mental health calls. There have been lots of people with autism and mental health breakdowns who have been killed by police. And this is after family members have warned police, you know, this person is suicidal right now, or they're having a mental health episode and they've wound up dead, which just, it makes absolutely no sense. I think the training needs to be overhauled because too often in Minneapolis, police have a shoot first, ask questions later mentality. And they've been allowed to get away with this for so many years. It's been unchecked power that led to the circumstances that we have. And then beyond that, of course, not being allowed to just pull people over and stop people for very low level offenses. That just doesn't make sense to me. There's a huge waste of resources that are happening when you're disrupting people's daily lives to stop them, to pull them over, to give them citations and to bring them into the system, knowing that, you know, they're likely not going to have adequate legal representation. And then it opens the door to a whole host of other collateral consequences. So we need to look again at the function of police. Police should be used for some of the most extreme and dangerous circumstances, not for the way in which they're used now, which is very disruptive to the lives of people of color and the working poor.
And I think, you know, that last point that you were touching on, you know, is something that I have thought about myself for a while. And I'm interested in your perspective. This idea of sort of proactive policing versus reactive policing. And I've heard the response from a lot of people with respect to what you were saying, in that, you know, we need to get past this idea that police should be stopping people from minor offenses in the hopes that there's something else going on. And one of the arguments I have made all the time, as a former criminal defense lawyer, someone who's engaged in these issues, is what we don't see is the other 99 times where somebody stopped and nothing happens and they're just being harassed. What we hear about is the one time where somebody has something and maybe they have something more, and we use that to justify these other instances where people's civil rights are being violated. And it seems that we're willing, I think in particular, the white majority is willing to say okay to those other 99 people in the name of safety and comfort and control. Essentially, is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. I mean, when you look at New York with the stop and frisk policy, same thing. They're willing to violate so many people's rights in the hopes of finding something. And thankfully, they're not allowed to, engage in those practices anymore, but it went on for years in the name of safety and comfort. The other thing that I think we need to realize is that all too often police are concentrated in low-income communities of color, and that is ignoring the fact that crime happens in white communities. It happens in suburban communities. It happens in middle class and upper middle class communities. But those folks are essentially able to get away scot-free with their behavior, with running drug and gun rings and supplying guns, into low-income communities of color, because police aren't looking there. Those are their neighbors, family members, friends. They are focusing on Black people as the problem, right? And again, this has its roots in slavery, where you would see the wanted posters of fugitive slaves being criminalized, even though they're inside of a system in which they are being brutalized, being forced to perform labor, back-breaking labor, for the benefit of white people and white families, yet they are the ones who are seen as the problem. So we have a huge crisis in this country in terms of misidentifying the poorest of the poor as being the biggest problem within these systems.
And I think, that reminds me of a concept that I remember hearing one time when I attended a speech by Brian Stevenson, who I'm sure you've heard of. And the concept that he was talking about was, proximity. That the reality is a large number of our cities around the country, and in particular Minneapolis, is still incredibly segregated. And like you're saying, it's they don't think that people don't think their neighbor three houses down is doing anything, but somebody in a different county or a different city, it's easy to say they are doing something. And that concept of we need to reshape proximity and make sure that we are close together with everybody. And so from all ethnic, racial, socioeconomic backgrounds, so that we don't have those views. Do you see that as a solution too?
I'm not sure that I see that as a solution, to be honest with you, because what we see most often in communities where there is some diversity is white people calling 911 on Black people. And that is very deadly and it's very dangerous. And it's often for, somebody has a boom car where they're playing music too loud, or they're hanging out in front of their home. It makes me uncomfortable. And they're calling 911, right? Knowing that there could be deadly consequences. I even had an incident that just happened on Saturday where I went to a local FedEx. I had a package redirected there from my office because I kept missing the FedEx people. And I'm like, oh, it'll be easier for me to just go to FedEx downtown and get my package. Well, I showed my ID, showed the tracking number, showed the text messages from FedEx. And the person said, well, you need to verify that you have some kind of connection to this address. I'm like, well, that's my office. You see my name, this is me. I had the package delivered here. And it just became a situation where I challenged their policy. And a young white man who I was dealing with said, I'm calling security on you. Like, it really went from 0 to 100. And I'm like, if I was white, you wouldn't even think about calling security. But the fact that I was a Black woman coming in that environment, I had a hoodie on, all of those things played a role in that person feeling that they could exert authority over me, and then that they could call security on me. So it's dangerous. It shouldn't have been dangerous for me to go to FedEx, but that is how I felt in the midst of that kind of circumstance. And it happens to Black people all the time. We're shopping in Target or wherever. Black people get trespassed all the time for asserting themselves or being too loud, according to the staff who work there. And then they are able to call the police, et cetera, et cetera. So unfortunately, because of the root of white supremacy that has not ever been addressed in this country, and the fact that police are often going to give deference to a white person over a Black person, it becomes dangerous when people live too close to each other in those circumstances, which is sad, but it's just the reality. Right. I think that if you want to have a cultural enclave, whether it's Hmong people living in that cultural enclave or Latinx people or Native American people or African American people, you should be able to do that without worrying about police needlessly taking a life in your community or criminalizing the people who live there. I shouldn't have to live next to white people in order to feel safe and protected. So that's why I challenge that notion, of proximity. I understand where Brian Stevenson is trying to go, but the reality of the situation doesn't necessarily square up with that mindset. I don't think just saying, oh, let's all integrate, let's all kumbaya, that hasn't worked, because how we perceive integration is typically anyone who is othered having to assimilate towards what white people think is important. And that does not work. If you have a different cultural background, different language, different religion, you're not going to fully be accepted. And you have to actually shrink who you really are in order to be acceptable to white people. And that's something I personally refuse to do. All I can do is be myself, and people accept it or they don't. But I shouldn't have to completely shift who I am to make white people feel comfortable.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I really appreciate you sharing your perspective on that. And I there was one other thing that you were talking about, with respect to, in particular, with city council and their plan going forward. And I was interested in your perspective on, because obviously we want our people who are in our governance to make the right decision. And sometimes that takes time in terms of research and development. And one of the things I've struggled with a lot is, how do you balance that time versus correcting the situation now? And I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Well, I think with regard to research, there's all kinds of best practices already, written down in terms of, how police can function in a more just manner. There are already experts out there, some of whom are former police officers who have gotten into the business of trying to create more equitable systems of policing. So it's not that there's a shortage of information, research, or experts. There is an unwillingness often on the parts of those who are in positions of authority to actually take whatever time it takes, however short or long, to do that research and to engage the people who understand, and including the community, right? Which has its own ideas about what it needs to feel safe. And I think that if city council had actually just the same amount of energy they put into appeasing white people in Powderhorn Park, they could have brought to North Minneapolis, they could have brought to Cedar Riverside and other communities that are impacted by police violence, and ask people, what do we want to see? And couple that with the best practices. Beyond that, some things are honestly just common sense, like removing the police officers who have a history of excessive force from the force to the extent possible. Now, part of why those in government claim that they haven't been able to do that is because of the arbitration rules that make it very difficult for an officer who's been fired to remain fired, right? They're able to challenge it through their unions and then get their jobs back. And some of that goes back to the policing contract that Minneapolis has in place that is extremely pro-police and doesn't have enough balance nor community oversight. So a couple of years ago, a group formed of individuals, including a couple lawyers as well, to look at the police contract in Minneapolis and to make a series of recommendations. Some of it included police officers not being able to work a full shift and then go work overtime, because of being fatigued, which is what some people attribute to why Mohammed Noor killed Justine Damon Rusacek, being exhausted from working all these different shifts and there not being accountability and checks and balances. Officers having to carry their own professional liability insurance. Because if you can be reckless on the job and then the city pays for it, there's no real checks and balance. There's no harm to your family, if it's not coming in your pocket. And so that's a recommendation. So there are very clear and concrete recommendations that would help address some of these issues. But again, those who are in positions of power often don't have the political will to do what it takes and the courage to stand against whatever hostility they may face from the police and sometimes from the white majority who empathize with the police no matter what they do.
And you referenced this idea of, community oversight. There's a couple commissions and committees that we've talked about in previous sessions that I think you're alluding to in terms of, the BCA and people who are currently involved in, investigating or disciplining officers. What do you see as potential solutions to holding officers accountable in terms of community oversight, like you're referencing?
So there's a local grassroots organization called Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar that formed in the aftermath of Jamar Clark being killed. And they are pushing for community control of police based on a model that has come out of Chicago, where there is, specific oversight by community members with regard to, looking at police involvement in incidences, critical incidences, providing, disciplinary recommendations, being able to fire and hire, things like that. That hasn't gained as much traction as maybe it should. And I think that part of that just has to do with the fact that most of us are comfortable with the system that currently exists because it may not have a direct impact on our loved ones. So we're comfortable, ceding that authority to people who unfortunately haven't been responsible in terms of managing the amount of power that law enforcement officers have and not providing appropriate checks and balances within that system. For many years, Minneapolis did not have a decent disciplinary policy. They were supposed to have an early warning system in place so that if an officer, for example, has a pattern of being disrespectful, talking down to people, the early warning system would trigger, an alert so that there could be an intervention to try to address the behavior or to decide, does this officer need to be removed? And even with their psychological testing, it is not adequate for addressing the issues that we're talking about. Most of the psychologists, if not all, are white, and they, beyond the initial interview regarding the psychological issues that people may have when they become police officers, they don't continue that testing after somebody's been on the job for 5 or 10 years and has, been burned out or has had a lot of stress and trauma. So you have a lot of cops walking around with PTSD. You have a lot of cops, which has been documented in the Star Tribune, who have a history of engaging in domestic violence amongst their partners and spouses. And yet they're still on the force as if this isn't an indication of violent tendencies, right? And so we see this information, but how many of us are going to the mayor, going to city council and demanding that there be some accountability or those officers be fired or they put in some type of a program or initiative to disrupt the cycle of domestic abuse that officers have been allowed to get away with? So I think that there are some really simple fixes, but again, there's a lack of political will and there's a lack of sustained public pressure as the reasons why these changes don't happen and reasons why people suddenly wake up from a slumber when there's a national catastrophe and then they go right back to sleep as if the rest of the system is fine. And that's the cycle I've seen over the years, time and time again. And it's sad and it's also infuriating.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree with you there. And it's something I think we touched on the other day when we were preparing is that, not only did it take the murder of George Floyd but it took it during a worldwide pandemic where people basically couldn't leave their houses for people to start, really taking some action, to that extent. So I think that that's a great point. There's a question that's a little bit of a change of topic, but I wanted to at least pose it to you from one of our participants. They're wondering if you're running for mayor again.
The short answer is no. I'm not running for mayor. When I ran the first time, I knew that I was more than qualified for the position. I predicted that Minneapolis would become the next Ferguson if we didn't rein in our police department. Like, we're living in a tinderbox and people don't know it. So I knew, based on my background, extensive experience, that I was qualified. But I said, I'm only running once, at this point. If people are going to support me, support me. If you're not, you're going to get what you vote for. And that's essentially what happened. And I don't want to be in a position of having to put on a cape as a Black woman who already carries a lot of weight and responsibility as a volunteer, out in the community trying to address these issues, to try to fix all of this when we had an opportunity to be proactive before it got to this point. So I'm living my best life, with my family. I have 4 biological children. My youngest is 3.5. So, she's out on the front lines with me sometimes, but, I really feel a sense of peace. Not at this point being in that position. I did what I could, but I also asked people to step up to the plate and run, and take on the responsibility for helping to shape what happens. I'm still very much involved. I mean, I can pick up the phone and call the current mayor, the chief, whomever, when an issue arises. But I'm not planning to run myself. No.
Well, thank you for letting us know that. We have a couple minutes left here, and I wanted to kind of finish up with what you're talking about. And you just referenced, other people need to step up and step into these roles and not do it in a comfortable way, to do it in a way that is pushing the boundaries and pushing these issues. And that, I think, as you've, I'm sure, experienced, there's going to be some backlash. There's going to be some pushback, but that's what happens when you're, advocating for these issues. And what do you see? We were talking the other day about, challenging people, essentially, and, getting them, especially us in the legal field, to push our boundaries, to push our comfort zone. What do you see as some of those things that people can do to get involved, to push their envelope, to push past their comfort zone?
Well, I think that the first step is realizing that you have a comfort zone, right? It may not feel that way because it's just life, and I know from being in the ivory tower of academia how comfortable I was. And I was shaken out of my discomfort when I went to Ferguson. And when I saw what was happening, I mean, snipers on the rooftops of buildings who weren't police, the oath keepers, pointing guns at people, being tear gassed, all of that rocked my world. It made me want to run out of Ferguson, just for fear, stress, all of that. But I saw young people, continuing to get back out there and stand up for a young man who could no longer speak for himself. So that reminded me, like, you have a responsibility, Nekima. You have, access to, education, all these other things. You have to do more. So I had to make it personal and bring history to life, the history I had read about, and come to a deeper understanding of what was my personal responsibility for rolling up my sleeves, getting involved, and getting way outside my comfort zone. It has taken me putting myself in very uncomfortable positions, having to challenge people, lawmakers, angry white folks, complacent white folks. I mean, it's taken a lot, but I lean on my faith in order to be able to persevere. And I would urge lawyers to get involved. I mean, there's so much work to do. And I think given that we live in a Minnesota nice culture, it's easy to stay in a process mode. I don't know how many groups I was in before I got out on the front lines where we're speaking, we're meeting for weeks and months and years and putting agendas together and bringing in people to talk and, laying out what we want to do, but never getting to the doing part, right? And never getting to the part where we're really willing to take a stand and push for the changes and be in the hot seat. you know, in order to do that. So I had to withdraw from a lot of that because I'm like, I can't spend so much of my time just processing, and not ever seeing results. And so as lawyers, we can get stuck in that process mode because we're taught to analyze, we're taught to use logic and reasoning. But at some point, we have to put our intellect, our skills, and our insights to use on behalf of those who are most vulnerable within these systems, right? And we talked about the man who taught Thurgood Marshall, Hamilton Houston, I think is his name, but he talked about, he was a law professor at Howard, and he trained Thurgood Marshall. And he talked about the fact that either a lawyer is an engineer for social change or he's a parasite. And I would say truer words have never been spoken. And so that means we have to look within ourselves and figure out, where are we placing our energy? What are our priorities and values? And what changes are we willing to make in order to affect change within society?
Yeah, and that, you know, I really appreciate that standpoint. It's something again that came up in the conversation I had with my family the other day. Yeah, because we were talking about, because people got upset during, you know, we were talking about these issues and people got upset, and I said, you know, part of this conversation is people are going to make mistakes. People are going to do things wrong. If we're so worried about always making mistakes, like you're saying, we're not doing anything. You need to get out and do something and admit when you do make a mistake, because you're going to make a mistake. You're going to do something wrong or say something wrong. The most important part is recognizing when you make a mistake, owning up to it, and figuring out a way to come to a solution, and really, you know, making the effort to, I think that goes plays a part in what you're saying about Minnesota Nice, not wanting to do or say anything wrong. So I really appreciate that perspective. You know, it's something that certainly resonates with me in my personal life, and we're running out of time here. I wish we could keep this conversation going, but I know you have a lot going on. But I just wanted to say a special thank you to you for joining us today. I know you're extremely busy. We appreciate everything that you're doing in the community, and we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us about what you're doing and how we can get involved. So thank you again for taking the time today, Nekima.
Thank you for having me. And I'll just say one last thing for those who are listening. Don't be afraid to color outside the lines. I mean, that's just the bottom line. Just make a decision to step up and get outside your comfort zone, and it'll make a world of difference on behalf of those whose voices aren't typically being heard in our society.
Great. I love that, coloring outside the lines. I love that. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.